You were never abandoned. I was the one who took you to that orphanage, and I never had the courage to tell you why. Taxi driver picks up an elderly passenger and laughs at her name. Seconds later, he cries upon discovering who she really is. What would you do if you found out that the person who supported you the most in childhood was also the one responsible for the greatest trauma of your life?
The rain fell incessantly over New York, turning the streets into water mirrors where the blinking lights of billboards shimmered in distorted reflections. Jake's windshield wiper creaked with every movement, struggling against the deluge that battered his beaten taxi. He let out a heavy sigh, keeping one hand firmly on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift, as he did every night. It was just another exhausting shift in his routine as a taxi driver. He drove through the streets, picking up passengers from all walks of life, from sharply dressed executives late for meetings to awestruck tourists trying to make sense of the city's chaos. But for him, it all boiled down to one thing: paying the bills. Rent was overdue, the electricity bill threatened to be cut off, and the constant noise of urban life was his only companion. He never thought about the past, or rather, he did everything he could to avoid it. He had grown up in a rundown orphanage where loneliness was a constant shadow. There were no family photos, no childhood stories worth remembering, just a succession of cold, indifferent days during which he learned that no one was coming to rescue him. But from time to time, certain memories resurfaced like shards of glass embedded in his skin. The smell of wet asphalt, for instance, always reminded him of nights at the orphanage when he would sneak to the window to watch the few cars passing on the distant road. He accelerated down a busy avenue, trying to push those thoughts away. The radio crackled with an old, muffled song, and he glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost time to end his shift. Maybe he would pick up one more fare before heading home. That's when he spotted the silhouette at the curb, a frail figure holding an umbrella that looked ready to be whisked away by the wind. He slowed down and pulled over, and the back door swung open quickly. An elderly lady with gray hair and a beige overcoat hurried in without waiting for him to say a word. "Municipal hospital, please, quickly!" Her voice trembled, heavy with urgency. Jake adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look at her. She was in her 70s, with a tense expression and hands clenched tightly around her purse on her lap. There was something about her that seemed out of place. He dealt with all kinds of passengers, but this woman radiated something different. An unease that made the air inside the car feel heavier. "All right, ma'am," he replied, accelerating. The taxi glided through the wet streets, dodging puddles and potholes. The roar of the engine filled the silence, but every so often, Jake glanced at her in the mirror. Her lips moved subtly, as if she were murmuring something to herself. Then, she said something that made his fingers tighten on the wheel. Jake Nolan. His full name. He frowned, glancing at her in the mirror. "What did you say?" The woman blinked a few times, seeming surprised at herself. "Sorry, it's just that I know you." Jake laughed, but without humor. "Know me? I think you're mistaken." Madeline kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "No, I would never mistake you." A chill ran down his spine. There was something in the way she spoke his name, with such familiarity that stirred an unease he couldn't explain. "From where?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman hesitated. She seemed to weigh her words, as if deciding how much she could reveal. "From the past," she replied vaguely. Jake laughed again, this time more nervously. "That doesn't help much." The taxi passed through a traffic light, and he tried to ignore the sensation that something was wrong. Strange passengers weren't new, but this woman, she seemed to know something he didn't. "You weren't abandoned, Jake," she said softly. Jake slammed on the brakes more abruptly than he intended. "What?" Madeline brought her hand to her chest, breathing irregularly. "You always thought you were left behind, that your mother didn't want you. But it wasn't like that." He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Her words stirred something deep inside him, a territory he avoided exploring. How do you know that? Madeline looked at him through the rearview mirror. Because I was there. Jake's heart began to race. There where? The elderly woman's face was pale, and her breathing became more labored. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered for a moment. Jake tensed, his fingers gripping the wheel. Ma'am, are you okay? She closed her eyes for a moment, mumbling something he could barely hear. I pulled you from her arms. The world seemed to spin for a moment. The sound of the rain faded, and the taxi slid slightly over the wet pavement as Jake, dazed, almost lost control of the car. What did you say? Madeline tried to continue, but her breathing failed her. She gasped, clutching her chest as if something inside her were breaking. Jake looked at the dashboard. They still had a few blocks to go until the hospital. Damn it. Ma'am, hold on. He accelerated, weaving around other cars, ignoring the angry horns behind him. His heart hammered in his chest. Who the hell was this woman? What did she know? Stay with me. You said you took me from the arms of whom? My mother. Madeline opened her mouth trying to speak, but her head slumped to the side. Jake felt his stomach churn. Ma'am! The hospital loomed on the horizon, and he slammed on the gas. The rain battered the car, and the windshield wiper could barely keep up with the view. His mind was a mess. He had never known his mother. He had never learned anything about her. Just heard disconnected stories in the orphanage about a baby left at the door. An unwanted baby. But now, this woman shows up out of nowhere and says it was all a lie? That he hadn't been abandoned? That someone had pulled him from his mother's arms? Why? He skidded into the hospital parking lot, screeching tires, and rushed out of the car, flinging open the back door. Help! He shouted to the attendants at the entrance. Two nurses rushed toward him, and he pulled the elderly woman out of the car, feeling her body light and fragile. She was saying strange things, then she started to get worse. I think it's serious. The nurses quickly placed her on a stretcher and pushed her inside the hospital. Jake stood frozen for a moment, soaked, watching her disappear down the corridors. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold skin beneath. If she died there, he would never know the truth. After all, who was Madeline Parker? And what else was she hiding? The automatic emergency doors swung open, and Jake rushed inside, feeling the rainwater trickle down his neck. Nurses were already pushing a stretcher with Madeline into the facility as he tried to keep up. His heart raced, and his mind was a jumble of unanswered questions. She said something strange, something about my mother. I need to talk to her. He tried to grab the arm of one of the nurses but was ignored. The medical team moved with precision and speed, guiding the elderly woman to a room at the back. A doctor in a white coat and tired eyes approached, blocking Jake's path. Sir, you need to wait here. Wait? She could die without telling me what she was saying. Jake ran a hand through his wet hair, frustration rising in his voice. The doctor, identified by his badge as Dr. Anton, sighed. We will do everything we can, but right now she needs treatment. If you are a close family member, we will ask you to sign the necessary documents. Jake took a deep breath. I'm not a relative. The doctor frowned. Then I can't give you any information. But she knows me. She said my full name. She said she had something important to tell me. The doctor's gaze remained impassive. That doesn't change the fact that without a legal relationship, you cannot have access to her. Jake felt his chest burn with anger. I brought this woman here. She was in my taxi, passed out in the back seat. Doesn't that count for anything? It means you did the right thing, and we thank you for that, the doctor replied, keeping his voice calm. But now you need to let the professionals do their work. Before Jake could argue, a nurse grabbed his arm and pointed to the waiting area. You can wait over there. He felt his body practically being shoved backward as the doors closed in front of him. Madeline had disappeared into the restricted area, and he was left alone in the corridor, feeling powerless. Gradually, his breathing slowed. The environment around him began to take shape again. The lobby was lit by cold, impersonal lights, and the plastic chairs were filled with weary people waiting for news about their loved ones. The smell of disinfectant and reheated coffee hung in the air. Jake ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of that night. He didn't know who Madeline was, but he knew she held the first real piece of the puzzle about his past. And now she was unconscious, perhaps on the brink of death, while he could do nothing but wait. He flopped down into one of the chairs, resting his elbows on his knees. His chest rose and fell heavily. With each passing second, his mind returned to the phrase Madeline had uttered before she fainted. "I pulled you from her arms." Those words clung to him like a parasite, repeating in a loop. What did that mean? Who was that woman? And most importantly, who was his mother? "Damn it," he murmured, feeling frustration rise. Jake looked at his phone. His hands trembled as he unlocked the screen. His thumb hovered over the contact list for a moment, hesitant. He wasn't one to ask for help from anyone, but tonight was different. He pressed a familiar name, Ethan. The phone rang a few times before a sleepy voice answered. Jake? Do you know what time it is?" Jake let out a humorless laugh. "I know. So why are you calling? Did something happen?" He took a deep breath. "Yes, and I don't even know where to start." On the other end, Ethan fell silent for a few seconds, which spoke volumes. "Okay, I'm listening." Jake rubbed his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts. "I picked up a passenger today, an elderly woman. She got into my taxi, asked to go to the hospital, and man, she knew my full name." "What? What do you mean?" "Out of nowhere. She looked at me and said, 'Jake Nolan,' as if she knew me." Ethan cleared his throat. "Okay, and who is this woman?" "I don't know. That's the problem. But before she passed out, she said I was never abandoned, that she herself pulled me from my mother's arms." The silence on the other end was longer this time. "Jake, this is serious? Do you think I'd joke about something like this?" "No, of course not. But have you ever heard anything about this before?" Jake rubbed his eyes again. "Never. You know how it was. We grew up hearing that our mothers didn't want us." "What if that's not true?" Jake felt a knot form in his throat. "I need to know." "And the woman, is she okay?" "She's in the hospital. Critical condition. I can't see her. I'm not a relative." Ethan let out a heavy sigh. "Jake, are you sure you want to dig into this?" Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "We've always known there were strange things at that orphanage. Do you remember the rumors? The kids who disappeared out of nowhere? If this woman has something to do with it, maybe it's better to leave it buried." Jake felt his chest tighten. "No, I can't do that." Ethan remained silent. "I spent my whole life thinking I was abandoned. Do you know what it's like to carry that? Now someone shows up and says it's not true. I can't ignore this." On the other end, his friend sighed again. "All right, what are you going to do?" "Wait for her to wake up and hope it's not too late." The call ended, and Jake shoved the phone into his pocket. His head throbbed. He looked at the doors of the ICU, where Madeline was, as if he could see her through the walls. He didn't know who she was, but he knew his life would never be the same.
Jake's entire world just turned upside down. For years, he believed he had been abandoned as a child. But now, a mysterious woman has revealed a shocking truth before losing consciousness. If she wasn't lying, then everything he thought he knew about his past is wrong. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Your support is essential for the growth of this channel and allows us to keep bringing emotional and impactful stories like this. Thank you. Now, let's move forward with the story.
Jake had been sitting in the hospital waiting room longer than he intended. The digital clock on the wall read 2:43 a.m., and the environment around him was silent, except for the distant ringing of a phone at the reception desk and the occasional hurried footsteps of nurses. His conversation with Ethan still echoed in his mind. We always knew something was wrong at that orphanage. He had never liked looking back, never wanted to revisit the past, but now he had no choice. There was something there that needed to be uncovered, and Madeline was the key to it all. But what if she never woke up? The thought made him stand up abruptly. His body was tired, but his mind was electric. He couldn't just sit there waiting for news that might never come. Minutes later, he was back in a cab, driving through the dark, rain-soaked streets of the city. The route to the old orphanage was automatic. His muscles seemed to remember the way better than his own mind. It had been years since he last passed by. He didn't even know if the building was still standing. When he finally arrived, he stopped across the street and just stared. The orphanage looked like a forgotten corpse amid the city. The windows were broken, some doors had been boarded up with old planks, and the once pale facade was now covered in cracks and graffiti. The sign above the entrance, which had once displayed the name of the institution, was so faded that it was barely legible. The cold wind of the early morning whistled through the debris as he crossed the street and forced his way in through the side of the building, where he knew the fence was broken. The gate creaked as it opened, and he stepped into the courtyard, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. As soon as he set foot in the main hallway, an avalanche of memories hit him. The sleepless nights in the communal dormitory, where the mattresses were too hard and thin to relieve the cold. The strict rules of the institution, where any slip-up resulted in severe punishments. The empty stares of the other children, all trapped in the same uncertain fate. And above all, the memory of her. Madeline. Now that he thought about it, the woman in the hospital. Could it be her? Time had transformed her, but there was something in her eyes that felt familiar. Back then, Madeline was seen as a stern, yet not cruel director. She rarely smiled, but also never raised her voice. She simply observed, always attentive. And now, after all these years, she claimed he had never been abandoned, that she had taken him from his mother's arms. Jake's head throbbed as he moved down the hallway, passing doors that no longer led anywhere. Some rooms still had old furniture covered in dust, remnants of moldy mattresses and broken cabinets. If there was anything that could give him answers, it would be in the old archive room. He pushed through a door with rusty hinges and found himself facing toppled shelves and papers scattered across the floor. The smell of mildew was strong, and the only sound was his boots crunching on yellowed documents and torn sheets. For some reason, his heart raced. He began rifling through the rusty drawers, pulling out papers and quickly reading anything that seemed relevant. Most were just standard records from the institution, lists of names, behavior reports, medical histories. But then something caught his attention. In a torn folder, he found fragments of a document that looked different. Names of companies, bank transactions, and a name that appeared repeatedly across several sheets. Oliver Grant. He frowned, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Who was Oliver Grant? He had never heard that name before, but it seemed this person had a financial connection to the orphanage. What did a businessman have to do with a place like this? Jake flipped through a few more pages, but most were destroyed by time and moisture. And then, his gaze froze on another piece of paper. Amid the torn documents, there was a fragment with a name partially visible. His blood ran cold. It was the name of his mother. Or at least it seemed to be. The writing was smudged, and part of the paper had been torn away, but the few characters that remained tightened his chest. His breath grew heavy, and he felt an overwhelming weight on his shoulders. His whole life he believed his mother simply abandoned him. There had never been a name, a face, a story, just a void. And now, right before him, there was evidence that she existed. But this only raised more questions. Who was she? Why was her name in the orphanage's records? Why did Madeline say she took him from her arms? The feeling of suffocation consumed him. The past was closer than ever, yet it still slipped through his fingers. He quickly exited the room, feeling the weight of each step on the rotting wooden floor. As he passed through the hallway, his gaze landed on the old dining hall. Memories surged again. The silent meals. The prayers before each meal, where starving children were forced to thank for the little they had. The whispers at night about those who were taken away and never returned. Jake swallowed hard. Looking at that place, he realized something. The orphanage was never a home. It was a place where secrets were buried. And Madeline knew everything. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Now he had a new objective. To discover who Oliver Grant was. And what the hell he had to do with his past. Jake drove through the bustling streets of New York City without a fixed destination. The city lights flickered through the windshield, reflecting his own state of mind, confused, restless, on the verge of exploding. The name he found in the orphanage documents wouldn't leave his mind. Oliver Grant. A name he had never heard before, but somehow tied to his past. Jake drove through the bustling streets of New York City without a fixed destination. The city lights flickered through the windshield, reflecting his own state of mind. Confused, restless, on the verge of exploding. The name he found in the orphanage documents wouldn't leave his mind. Oliver Grant. A name he had never heard before, but somehow tied to his past. He grabbed his phone and called Ethan. "Are you nearby?" he asked, keeping his voice tense. "Still on my shift at the warehouse. What's up?" Ethan replied on the other end. "I need help. I found a name at the orphanage. A guy named Oliver Grant." Silence stretched for a few moments. "That name sounds familiar, but from where?" "I don't know, and that's what I want to find out. Can you help me track this guy down?" Ethan sighed. "All right, give me a few minutes." Jake drove to a parking lot and waited. Time seemed to drag as he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his mind swirling around the new information. He had never had a single clue about his origins, and now, suddenly, names were popping up from all directions. His phone vibrated. "I found something," Ethan said, getting straight to the point. "Oliver Grant is a businessman, an investor in several companies, owner of some properties in Manhattan. And what does he have to do with the orphanage?" "That's still unclear, but he was one of the backers." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "You're telling me that a Manhattan magnate was financing a rundown orphanage in the middle of nowhere?" "Exactly. And there's more. It seems the funding was personal. They weren't donations recorded with any organization." That didn't make sense. Why would a man like Oliver Grant be interested in funding a forgotten institution? "Where does he work?" Jake asked. "He has an office on 57th Street in one of the commercial skyscrapers." Jake thought for a moment. He couldn't just walk in and demand answers. Men like Oliver Grant didn't entertain strangers. "Do you think you can get me away into that building?" Ethan laughed. "Going straight to the wolf's den, huh?" "If this guy knows anything about my mother, I need to find out." "Then we'll figure it out." The next morning, Jake got to work. He headed to the skyscraper where Oliver's office was located and watched the flow of executive drivers picking up and dropping off businessmen at the location. With a taxi parked discreetly on the corner, he waited for an opening. That's when he saw one of the private drivers arguing with the security guard at the side entrance. The man looked irritated, gesturing and pointing at the car. Jake didn't waste time. He got out of the taxi and walked over, pulling out a key from his own pocket as if he already worked there. "What's going on?" he asked, adopting a professional tone. The security guard sighed. "Mr. Grant's car was supposed to pick up an important investor today, but the driver ran into some trouble on the way." Jake raised his hand. "I can cover for him." The guard stared at him for a moment. "You're part of Oliver's team?" Jake nodded quickly. "I work as a freelance driver." The guard hesitated for a moment, then glanced at his watch and huffed. "Okay, head to the VIP entrance." Jake swallowed his anxiety and followed the indicated path, bringing the taxi along as if he were part of the businessman's crew. Soon after, an assistant came over to him, and without even questioning said, "Mr. Grant wants you to take him to a business lunch." Jake forced a nod and waited for Oliver Grant to appear. When the figure of the man emerged, he felt a shiver. Oliver Grant was a man of controlled appearance, dressed in an impeccable suit and sunglasses. Even without knowing him, Jake could sense the aura of power and coldness he exuded. He opened the taxi door and waited for Oliver to get in. "Where to, Mr. Grant?" "Midtown, Astor Restaurant." Jake began to drive, maintaining a strategic silence. He needed the right approach to avoid startling him. As they crossed Park Avenue, he broke the silence. "Do you know the St. Mary's Orphanage?" Oliver, who had been fiddling with his phone, slowly raised his eyes. "Yes." Jake felt his fingers tighten around the steering wheel. "And director Madeline Parker?" This time, Oliver completely shifted his gaze from the screen. "Yes. Why are you asking about that?" Jake felt his stomach churn. "Because I grew up in that place." Oliver looked at him through the rearview mirror. "And now, what exactly do you want to know?" Jake took a deep breath, controlling his anger. "I want to know why your name was in the orphanage files. I want to know why you were sending money directly to Madeline Parker." Oliver remained impassive for a few seconds. "You're Jake Nolan?" Jake felt his blood run cold. "How do you know my name?" Oliver adjusted his glasses as if measuring the situation. "I knew one day you would show up." Jake's breath grew shallow. "Show up for what?" Oliver sighed. "Your name, kid. It was never forgotten." Jake felt his chest tighten. "What does that mean?" Oliver relaxed in the seat, folding his hands. "Madeline approached me years ago. She needed an investor for the orphanage, but the truth was different. She was protecting a secret." "What secret?" Oliver turned his face to the window. "Your mother." Jake felt tingles in his fingers on the steering wheel. "What about her?" Oliver looked back at him. "She was going to run away with you." Time seemed to stop. "What do you mean?" "She didn't abandon you. She wanted you." But Madeline intervened. Jake felt a surge of adrenaline. "Madeline said she ripped me from her arms. Are you saying that's true?" Oliver nodded. "Your mother planned to flee the city. But Madeline made a deal. She convinced your mother that the best thing for you was to be left at the orphanage." Jake felt his head spin. "And you?" Oliver gave a half smile. "I was just the man who helped maintain the agreement." Jake slammed on the brakes hard, the taxi skidding slightly on the avenue. He looked at Oliver, furious. Jake's mind was in chaos. He parked the cab on some random street, turning off the engine but remaining there, staring at the dashboard without really seeing anything. Oliver Grant's words echoed in his head like thunder that never faded. "She was going to run away with you." Madeline interfered. He clenched his fists on the steering wheel. Everything he knew about his childhood, everything he believed to be true, was being dismantled before him. The director of the orphanage, the woman he remembered as a stern yet gentle figure, was now at the center of a dark scheme that robbed him of the only thing he ever wanted: a mother. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ethan. The call connected on the third ring. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, and Jake realized his breath was still ragged. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "Did you get anything out of that Oliver Grant guy?" Jake hesitated before responding. "He said my mother never abandoned me, that Madeline negotiated for her to be taken away." The silence on the other end of the line was almost suffocating. "Are you sure he said that?" Ethan's voice came out muffled, almost a whisper. "Do you think I'd make something like that up?" Ethan took a deep breath. Man, that makes sense. A lot of sense." Jake closed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, and Jake could hear a bottle being set down on a table in the background. "When we were kids, I remember hearing Madeline talking to a man. I didn't know who it was, but I remember some words." Jake frowned. "What words?" Ethan cleared his throat before repeating. It's better that this mother disappears for good. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What? That's what she said. I never understood what it meant. But after you told me about Oliver Grant and the donations to the orphanage, everything seems to fit together. Jake rubbed his face with his hands, trying to organize his thoughts. Why didn't you tell me this? Because back then I thought it was just some random conversation. And then I forgot. Or wanted to forget. Jake gritted his teeth. This changes everything. I know, Ethan replied, and his voice carried a weight Jake had never heard before. The clock had passed midnight when Jake realized he wouldn't be able to sleep. His whole body was tense, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Without thinking much, he grabbed the keys to the cab and drove to the hospital. The building was quieter than the last time, the hallways emptier, except for the nighttime staff. He walked up to the reception desk and asked for Madeline. The nurse checked the records. Her condition is unstable. She had a cardiac arrhythmia episode a few hours ago. Jake felt a tightening in his chest. Did she say anything? The woman shook her head. She's unconscious. Dr. Anton is monitoring her. Jake closed his eyes for a second. Part of him wanted Madeline to wake up right then and explain everything. But another part feared the answer. He didn't know if he could face her after everything he had learned. Can I see her? The nurse hesitated. Only direct family members are allowed. Jake stared at the woman. Do you want to know the truth? She lifted her eyes from the monitor. Madeline Parker is the only person who can tell me about my mother, and if she doesn't wake up, I'll never know what happened. The nurse furrowed her brow. You're her son? Jake hesitated, then shook his head. No, but somehow my life is tied to hers. She sighed, looking around to make sure no one was watching. Go ahead, 10 minutes at most. Jake murmured a thank you and crossed the hallway to the ICU. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the heart monitors. The rhythmic sound of the machines filled the space. Madeline looked smaller than he remembered. Age seemed to weigh on her in a way he had never noticed before. He stood still beside the bed, looking at her. For the first time, he realized how shattered her image was within him. For years, he had seen her as the rigid woman who supervised the orphans with a mixture of discipline and sweetness. But now, knowing what she was capable of, he felt a hatred growing inside him. She had torn him from his mother's arms. And perhaps his mother had disappeared because of her. Do you have any idea what you did to me? His voice came out low, a whisper laced with pain. Madeline didn't respond. He clenched his fists. You always said I should be strong, that I should accept the things I couldn't change, but I never accepted it. I always wanted to know why. He looked at her wrinkled hands resting on the blanket. And now you have the chance to tell me. The heart monitor beeped slowly and steadily. Jake exhaled and ran his hands through his hair. Damn, he murmured. He turned to leave, but then he heard a faint noise. His heart raced. He turned back. Madeline's eyes remained closed, but her fingers moved slightly. Jake froze. Then, very softly, her voice emerged, almost a whisper. I tried to protect you. Jake felt his stomach drop. He held onto the edge of the bed, leaning closer to her. From what? Madeline didn't respond. Jake felt frustration wash over him. Madeline? From what? But she returned to her still state, as if she had never spoken. Jake held his breath. Then the heart monitor beeped faster. The door swung open and a nurse rushed in. You need to leave. Jake hesitated. But she spoke. She said, now! Jake's heart hammered as he stepped out of the room. He paused in the hallway, his hands trembling. She tried to protect him? From whom? And more importantly, What did she do to ensure that protection? The silence of the hospital was interrupted only by Jake's hurried footsteps, echoing down the corridors. The call he received at dawn was enough to jolt him out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Madeline had awakened. He didn't know how he would react upon seeing her again. Part of him wanted to force the truth out of her, to make her confess what she had done. But another part feared that, once again, she would speak only half-truths, twisting the facts to justify the unforgivable. As soon as he arrived at the ICU, he found Dr. Anton waiting for him. The doctor, usually composed, wore a more serious expression than usual. "She woke up a few hours ago," he informed. "She's weak but conscious. She asked to see you." Jake nodded but didn't enter right away. He stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of the moment. He didn't just want answers. He wanted justice for all the years of emptiness, for all the suffering of his childhood. He took a deep breath. He didn't know how he would react upon seeing her again. Part of him wanted to force the truth out of her, to make her confess what she had done. But another part feared that, once again, she would speak only half-truths, twisting the facts to justify the unforgivable. As soon as he arrived at the ICU, he found Dr. Anton waiting for him. The doctor, usually composed, wore a more serious expression than usual. "She woke up a few hours ago," he informed. "She's weak but conscious. She asked to see you." Jake nodded, but didn't enter right away. He stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of the moment. He didn't just want answers. He wanted justice for all the years of emptiness, for all the suffering of his childhood. He took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. Madeline was propped up against the pillow, her pale skin illuminated by the bright light of the room. Her eyes, now open, met his with a mix of exhaustion and guilt. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Jake broke the silence. "You lied to me my whole life." His voice was firm, but it trembled slightly. Moistening her parched lips, Madeline tried to sit up straighter in bed. "Jake," she murmured, but he raised a hand to interrupt her. "No, now you will listen," he shot back, anger spilling over. "You ripped me from my mother. You conspired with Oliver Grant to separate her from me. You decided she wasn't good enough and threw me into that damn orphanage." Madeline's eyes filled with tears and her breathing grew erratic. "I tried to protect you." Her voice came out in a whisper, but Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Protect? From whom? My own mother? What kind of protection is that?" She brought a hand to her chest, trying to catch her breath. "You don't understand. I couldn't let her keep you." Jake clenched his fists. "Why not?" Madeline took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to speak. Then her eyes locked onto his, and she said something that made him hold his breath. "Because your mother was being hunted." The world seemed to close in around him. Madeline averted her gaze, staring at a fixed point on the wall. "Georgina, your mother," her voice faltered. "She got involved with dangerous people, Jake. Very dangerous. She was desperate, with no way out. And I did what I thought was the only way to save you." Jake felt the blood run cold in his veins. "What do you mean by dangerous people?" he asked, his voice lower now but still loaded with fury. "I knew your mother before you were born," Madeline continued, her eyes filled with memories. "She was a strong woman, but she made wrong choices. She got involved with the wrong crowd. By the time she realized the danger she was in, it was too late." Jake felt his stomach churn. "So you thought the solution was to take me away from her?" Madeline nodded slowly. "If you had stayed with her, they would have found you too. I had to choose, Jake, between losing you forever or ensuring your safety." His anger was a volcano ready to erupt. "And how could you be so sure? What made you decide that my mother didn't deserve to be with me?" Madeline closed her eyes for a moment as if reliving something painful. "Because I saw what they did to her. I saw the terror in her eyes when she realized there was no way out. She begged me to take you away. She said that if she stayed with you, she would condemn you too." Jake shook his head. You're lying. You always lied. Madeline opened her eyes, staring at him. Your mother is still alive? Jake's world stopped. He looked at Madeline, stunned. What? She's alive, Jake, Madeline repeated. But she never recovered. After she lost you, she was institutionalized. She's been in a psychiatric facility for years. Jake felt his legs give way. The chair next to the bed was the only thing that prevented him from collapsing. No, this doesn't make sense. Madeline grasped his hand tightly, and he found himself unable to pull away. I know I did horrible things, Jake, but you need to understand. I did it because I thought it was the only option. I never wanted her to suffer like this. I never wanted you to grow up not knowing the truth. Jake yanked his hand back. And you're only telling me this now? Madeline's eyes were red from tears. Because now I know you deserve to know, and because I don't know how much time I have left. The anger in Jake began to give way to something he didn't want to feel. A knot tightened in his chest, mixing all his emotions at once. Where is she? His voice came out in a whisper. Madeline pulled an envelope from beneath the sheets. The address of the clinic. The decision is yours, Jake. But please, before you judge me forever, go see her. Jake took the envelope with trembling hands. He stared at it for a few moments, feeling as if he held the weight of his entire existence in that piece of paper. Then he stood up, tucking the paper into his pocket. If all this is true, you destroyed 2 lives. Madeline closed her eyes. I know. Jake turned to leave. But before he crossed the door, he heard Madeline's weak voice once more. Jake. He stopped but didn't look back. I just wanted you to be safe. Jake didn't respond. He simply walked out of the room, his heart heavier than ever. Now, holding that envelope, he knew he had no choice. He needed to find his mother and discover the whole truth once and for all.
Madeline has finally woken up and confessed a painful secret. Jake's mother didn't abandon him. She was taken away. And now she's alive but trapped in a psychiatric clinic, lost in time and memory. The truth is closer than ever, but will Jake be ready to face it? Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Your engagement is crucial to help this channel grow and bring more powerful stories to life. Thank you. Now, let's continue the journey.
Jake left the hospital without looking back. The envelope with the clinic's address was crumpled between his sweaty fingers, as if that piece of paper weighed tons. His mind was racing. For years, he had accepted that his mother had abandoned him. Now, he discovered that she was alive, but not in the way he had imagined. The knot in his throat tightened. He wanted answers. He needed them. But was he prepared for what he would find? Back at his small apartment, Jake rummaged through drawers, gathering everything he could sell. His watch, an old gift from one of the orphanage staff, a pair of leather boots he rarely wore, even an old radio that took up space on the shelf. Each item he left behind felt like a part of himself disintegrating, but nothing mattered more than that journey. He glanced at the bills piled on the table, the overdue notices. None of that would stop his decision. He would postpone the rent, the utilities, anything necessary to finance the trip. When Ethan showed up at the door that night, he immediately knew what his friend was about to do. Have you lost your mind? Ethan crossed his arms, his eyes filled with concern. Jake, this woman has been hiding for years. Do you really think you can just show up and say, "Hi, I'm your son," and everything will be fine? I don't know what will happen, Jake replied, not meeting his gaze. But I need to go. I need to see for myself. Ethan sighed heavily and ran his hands over his face. He knew Jake too well to think he could change his mind. What if she's not who you expect? He insisted. What if this destroys you even more? Jake finally looked at him, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. I'm already destroyed, Ethan. I just want to understand why. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, defeated. At least let me go with you. No, Jake shook his head. I need to do this alone. The journey was long and silent. The bus cut through the deserted road, the streetlights flickering sporadically along the way. Jake kept the envelope tucked in his pocket, as if opening it and looking at the address again would make everything more real than it already was. With every kilometer traveled, his mind sank deeper into memories he had tried to bury for years. The smell of disinfectant from the orphanage, the cold corridors, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering why his mother never came back for him. The muffled cries of other children, the punishments, the feeling of belonging nowhere. Now, knowing the truth was different, each memory took on a new meaning. Who was Georgina? Who was this woman that Madeline deemed too dangerous to raise her own child? The bus made a stop at a roadside diner, but Jake didn't get off. He felt no hunger. The weight in his chest seemed greater than his entire body. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the thoughts away, but all he saw was Madeline's aged face saying, "I just wanted you to be safe." He no longer knew what was true. The trip took almost an entire day. When he finally got off in the small town, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple. The address indicated a location off the beaten path, so he took a taxi there. The driver didn't ask questions, but cast a brief glance at Jake in the rearview mirror when he saw the destination. "St. Helena Clinic?" he asked in a neutral tone. Jake nodded. "Never heard of it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The driver shrugged. "Some say it's a good place, others say it's where people are forgotten." The phrase sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He didn't respond. He just watched as the narrow road turned into a dirt path, flanked by tall trees swaying in the wind. When the taxi stopped, Jake felt his throat go dry. The clinic was smaller than he had imagined, a two-story white building with tall windows and curtains always drawn. The garden in front was well kept, but there was something melancholic about the landscape, something that made time seem slower there. He paid for the ride and got out, walking hesitantly toward the entrance. At the reception desk, a nurse with thin glasses looked at him with a mix of professionalism and caution. "Can I help you?" Jake swallowed hard. "I'm here to see Georgina Holloway." The woman frowned and typed something into the computer. "Are you a relative?" He hesitated. "I'm her son." The nurse's expression changed. It became more careful. She took a deep breath before responding. "Georgina's condition is delicate. She hasn't had visitors in many years, and when she does, she doesn't react well." Jake's heart raced. "I want to see her anyway." The nurse was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "Follow me." They walked down a corridor illuminated by dim lights. Jake could feel his palms sweating. Each step seemed to take him closer to a past he had never known. When they stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway, the nurse turned to him. "She may not recognize you." Jake didn't respond. He just nodded and turned the doorknob. The room was small, with a bed against the wall and a single chair beside it. The woman sitting on the bed stared into space, her pale hands resting in her lap. Her once blonde hair was now thin and gray. Her eyes had a dull shine, trapped in a distant world. Jake felt a tightness in his chest. She didn't look like the strong woman he had imagined. She didn't seem like someone who had fought. She looked broken. He approached slowly. "Georgina?" The woman didn't react. He moistened his lips, feeling a knot in his throat. "Mom?" Georgina's eyes flickered for a moment, as if the word had stirred something within her. But then, they returned to wandering aimlessly. Jake swallowed the sob that threatened to escape. His chest hurt as if it were being crushed. "It's me," he tried again, his voice choked. "I'm your son." Nothing. The nurse watched him with compassion, but Jake didn't want pity. He wanted a reaction. Anything. He wanted her to look at him and say she remembered, that she had always known, that she missed him. But all he got was silence. His heart shattered into a million pieces. He sat down in the chair next to the bed, running his hands over his face. The weight of his entire life seemed to collapse on his shoulders. After everything, after so many years of questions, the truth was worse than any lie. Georgina was alive. But she didn't know who he was. And maybe she never would. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the bitter taste of disappointment. Now, only one question remained. If his mother was lost forever within her own mind, how would he discover the truth? Jake sat beside Georgina's bed, watching her in silence. The clock on the wall marked time cruelly, as if every second were a reminder that he could have found his mother years ago. But now, all he had was a woman who didn't recognize him, a woman whose mind was shattered by time and pain. He cleared his throat, searching for a way to bridge the chasm between them. "Do you like music?" His voice came out low and hesitant. "When I was little, I used to listen to the radio in the kitchen of the orphanage. There was a song, something about rain and autumn. I don't remember the lyrics, but it made me feel less alone." Georgina didn't react. Her eyes remained fixed on some invisible point on the wall. Jake clenched his hands, trying to keep calm. "I wanted to know what your voice sounded like when you sang to me. I wanted to know if you used to stroke my head before I fell asleep. I spent years imagining those things, Mom." The word slipped out before he realized it, and a knot formed in his throat. Mom. He had never called anyone that before. The weight of that word was immense, yet so fragile. He sighed and ran a hand over his face. "But maybe it doesn't matter now, does it? Because I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to a memory of you that may never come back." Jake stood up slowly, feeling engulfed by an overwhelming sadness. He was about to leave when he heard a faint whisper. "Jake!" He froze. His heart raced. Georgina blinked several times, her eyes once empty, now filled with tears. Her lower lip trembled and she seemed to struggle to breathe. "Jake!" she repeated, her voice choked. Her fingers clenched the sheet as if trying to grasp something invisible. "They took you from me. Forgive me, son." Those words hit Jake like a punch to the chest. His vision blurred and he moved closer, kneeling beside the bed. "Mom?" His voice was laced with emotion. "Do you remember me?" Tears streamed down Georgina's face. She raised her trembling hand and touched Jake's face, as if ensuring he was real. Her eyes held a mixture of pain, love, and guilt. I tried to keep you," she sobbed, struggling. "But they... Suddenly, her body began to tremble. Her eyes widened, and a strangled sound escaped her throat. "Mom!" Jake grasped her hand, feeling despair swell within him. "What's happening?" The machines beside the bed began to beep frantically. Georgina's body contorted in spasms, and nurses rushed into the room within seconds. "Sir, we need you to step back," one of the nurses said as she held Georgina. "No! I'm here!" Jake shouted, feeling powerless. "Stay with her. Don't let her die." But the medical team was already moving Georgina from the bed, rushing her for emergency care. As they wheeled her down the hallway, she struggled and screamed. "Jake, my son, my boy." Her voice sliced through the air like a sharp blade. It was a cry of pain, of despair. It was the lament of a mother who had lost her child, and now that she had found him again, she was being ripped away from him once more. Jake tried to run after them, but a nurse held him back. "She's having a nervous breakdown. We need to stabilize her." Jake fought against the firm grip on his arm, but he knew he could do nothing. He watched his mother disappear down the corridor, her cries echoing until they faded into a distant murmur. Then, silence. He stood there, frozen, feeling his chest rise and fall uncontrollably. His hands trembled. He wanted to break something, wanted to scream. But none of that would change what had just happened. He had finally found her. And in a matter of minutes, he lost her again. Jake felt his legs weaken, and he sank onto a nearby bench. His head was spinning. He tried to take a deep breath, but it felt as if there wasn't enough air in the world to fill his lungs. A doctor approached, his expression grave. "We're stabilizing your mother, but she's in critical condition." The outburst was caused by an overwhelming emotional overload. Jake looked at him, unable to say anything. "I would recommend that you take some time before trying to see her again," the doctor continued. "We don't know how her mind will react to another sudden memory." Jake closed his eyes, clenching his fists. Each word from that doctor felt like a punch to his soul. His mother was there, alive, and yet unreachable. Why did Madeline do this to them? Why did Oliver Grant participate in this destruction? Why did his mother have to suffer so much? He couldn't stay there any longer, not while everything inside him screamed for answers. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. "I'm going back to the city," he announced. The doctor frowned. "Are you sure? I know this was a shock for you." "I can't just sit here while the people who ruined my family live without consequences," Jake said, his voice heavy with cold fury. "I will force the truth out of Madeline, and if she can't give me that answer, I will find someone who can." He glanced one last time down the corridor where his mother had vanished. Then, he turned and left the clinic. The road back to the city never seemed so long, but each kilometer only reinforced the decision within Jake. Someone had to pay for all of this, and he wouldn't rest until the truth was completely unearthed. The city felt even more oppressive when Jake returned. The lights of Manhattan shone as if mocking the storm within him. The traffic was slow, but his mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour. He needed to act fast. Something told him that time was running out. As soon as he entered Ethan's small apartment, he found his friend surrounded by papers scattered across the table. There were old folders, stamped documents, and even some faded photographs. Ethan's expression was grim. "I did what I could, man," Ethan said, pushing one of the papers toward Jake. "Oliver is in the authorities' crosshairs. I found out he was involved in several fraud schemes. The orphanage was just one of his dirty businesses." Jake took the document with trembling hands. Oliver Grant's signature was there, authorizing transactions that had diverted money meant for the orphanage years ago. But that wasn't all. On one of the pages, there was a receipt for a large sum, paid directly to Madeline Parker. "This," Jake whispered, feeling his stomach churn. "She was paid?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think the money was to ensure Georgina never saw him again. The rest? Well, it seems Oliver had his own reasons for wanting to get rid of your mother." Jake clenched the paper, a bitter taste in his mouth. Madeline had accepted money to tear him away from his own mother. That made everything even worse. "Where is Oliver now?" Jake asked, his voice heavy with anger. "Still free," Ethan replied. "But not for long. He already knows they're after him. I bet he's trying to cover his tracks before it's too late." Jake ran his hands over his face. He didn't know what he felt. Hate? Disgust? Or just a weariness that seeped into his bones? His phone vibrated in his pocket. He answered without thinking. "Mr. Jake, this is Dr. Anton." Jake's heart stopped for a second. "What happened?" he asked, fearing the answer. "It's Madeline," said the doctor. "Her condition has worsened. She wants to see you. Now." Jake stood still for a moment. A part of him wanted to ignore that call. But the other knew he had to go. He grabbed his keys and rushed out. The hospital was steeped in an uncomfortable silence when Jake entered. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the chill of the corridors only heightened his discomfort. Dr. Anton was waiting for him at the door of the ICU. "She's very weak," he warned. "I don't know how much time she has." Jake nodded and entered the room. Madeline looked smaller than he remembered. The white strands of her hair were splayed across the pillow, and her skin had a pale, almost translucent tone. Her eyes, once so imposing, were now weary but still carried a heavy weight. "Jake!" Her voice came out raspy, fragile. "You came." He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say. Anger, disgust, confusion. It was all there, suffocating him. But he needed answers. "I know everything," he finally said, stepping closer. "I know about the money. I know you negotiated with Oliver to keep my mother away." Madeline closed her eyes, as if bracing for an inevitable blow. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I didn't want it to be like this," she murmured. I thought I was protecting you." Jake laughed without humor. "Protecting? You destroyed my family." Madeline turned her head, looking at him with eyes filled with regret. "I made a terrible mistake," she whispered. "A mistake I've carried all these years." Jake crossed his arms, trying to maintain his composure. "So tell me, why did you do it?" She took a deep breath, struggling. "Your mother, Georgina, she was involved with dangerous people. Men who used her, who manipulated her. I saw what was happening and feared that if you stayed with her, you would be dragged into that world. I wanted to save you." Jake felt a knot in his throat. The story was different from what he had imagined, but it still hurt. "So you decided to rip a baby from its mother's arms? As if you had that right?" Madeline coughed, her frail body contracting. "I thought," her voice trembled, "that I was doing the right thing. I thought I was saving you, but I didn't see what it would do to your mother." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't see how much it would break her." Jake felt his eyes sting, but he refused to cry. "You took everything from her," he said, his voice heavy. "And now that you're here, asking for forgiveness, does that change anything?" Madeline stretched her trembling hand, trying to reach him. "No, it doesn't change anything," she admitted. "But, Jake, I just want you to know. I loved you as if you were my grandson. It wasn't just blame. It wasn't just regret. I truly loved you." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to feel only anger. But deep down, he knew she was speaking the truth. He looked at the woman who had, for years, been a strange figure in his life. A woman who had destroyed his past but who somehow believed she was saving him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he finally said. "But I will try." Tears streamed down Madeline's face. A weak smile appeared on her lips. That is already enough." Silence filled the room. Jake felt a tightness in his chest. He wanted to say more, wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. He stood up slowly. "I need to go," he said. Madeline nodded slightly. "Go, live your life, Jake. You deserve more than the past I gave you." Jake looked at her for one more moment. Then, without saying anything else, he turned and left the room. As he walked down the corridor, he felt devastated. He didn't know if he would return to see her. And deep down, he feared that this might have been the last time. The next morning arrived colder than usual. A fine mist hung over the city, cloaking the skyscrapers in a melancholic gray. Jake parked the taxi in front of the hospital and remained still for a few moments, his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. Something inside him weighed heavily, a foreboding he couldn't shake off. He didn't know what he was expecting to find as he crossed those doors once again. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The smell of disinfectant and old coffee filled the air as he crossed the main entrance. His boots echoed on the polished floor as he walked toward the nursing station. Dr. Anton was there, his expression heavy with fatigue. When he saw Jake, his eyes reflected a burden the cab driver didn't want to face. "Jake," the doctor began, his voice deep but careful. "Madeline passed away in the early morning." The words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He blinked, trying to absorb the news, but there was no space to process it. It was as if his brain refused to accept what he had just heard. Madeline, the woman who had shattered his past and, in some strange way, had been an enigmatic figure in his life, was no longer there. "How?" His voice came out hoarse. Her heart gave out. It wasn't unexpected considering her condition, but the doctor hesitated. "Before she left, she asked to leave something for you." Jake felt his stomach drop. Dr. Anton handed him a small white envelope, carefully folded. There was only a single phrase written on the front. "For Jake." He took the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper was rough, yellowed, as if Madeline had held onto that piece of her farewell for too long before giving it up. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a small note, written in shaky, almost illegible letters. "Jake, I'm sorry, you were always my greatest treasure. M." His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the paper as if holding it could somehow bring her back. But that was it. No final explanation. No grand revelation. Just those words, filled with regret and, in a strange way, love. He left the hospital without saying anything. The city around him felt distant, as if he were trapped in another time. The sounds of the street were muffled. The honks and chatter felt like echoes from a world he no longer belonged to. His body led him to a nearby cafe, a small, unassuming place where he used to stop before starting his shift in the taxi. He ordered a coffee but didn't drink it. He just sat there, staring at the steam rising from the cup, remembering the last conversation with Madeline. Fragments of memories came rushing back like a whirlwind. The distant sound of a lullaby. The cold room of the orphanage. The lonely nights staring at the ceiling, listening to Madeline sing to calm the crying children. Jake closed his eyes, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to cling to the anger that had kept him going for so many years. But, in that moment, all he felt was overwhelming pain. Madeline had been wrong. She had destroyed lives. But deep down, she truly believed she was doing what was right. He let out a long, exhausted sigh. That same day, news began to circulate. Oliver Grant was officially under investigation for fraud and corruption schemes. The orphanage's name was exposed in the media, and the story gained traction. Others began to emerge, former residents, staff members, many bringing similar stories marked by neglect and broken promises. Ethan sent him a message with a link to a report. "It's time for him to pay," the friend wrote. Jake opened the link and saw a photo of Oliver, trying to hide his face from photographers as he got into a luxury car. The article spoke of bribes, forged documents, an illegal adoption scheme that had never been investigated until now. But none of that changed what was already lost. Night fell as Jake made a decision. He could no longer continue wandering aimlessly. He could no longer live in the shadow of the past, carrying anger that would lead him nowhere. There was still something he could do. The next day, he took the taxi and drove for hours to the psychiatric clinic where his mother was interned. The building was the same, with its pale walls and silent corridors. When he entered Georgina's room, she was sitting on the bed, staring out the window with vacant eyes. Jake approached slowly. He sat down beside her, saying nothing at first. "I'm going to take care of you," he said after a while. "No matter how long it takes, I won't leave you behind." She didn't respond. She continued looking outside, as if her mind were lost in a distant time. But Jake knew he was there, and that was enough. A few weeks later, he returned to the orphanage. The building was more deteriorated than ever. Broken windows, doors falling apart. But to him, it still seemed exactly like the place where he had spent his entire childhood. That place that had seen him grow up. That had been both prison and home. He took Madeline's note from his pocket and held it against his chest. For a moment he thought about throwing it away, but he didn't. The scars of the past would never completely fade, but he wouldn't let them define him. Jake took a deep breath and, with one last look at the orphanage, turned and walked away. This time, without looking back.
Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the truth we seek comes at a cost. Jake's journey was one of pain, revelation, and healing. He uncovered the devastating reality of his past, yet in doing so, he found a new purpose, despite the betrayals, the loss, and the scars left behind. He chose to move forward, carrying both the weight of his history and the hope for a better future. This story reminds us that forgiveness isn't always about excusing the past. It's about freeing ourselves to embrace what lies ahead. Even when we can't change what happened, we can decide how it will shape us. What would you have done in Jake's place? Could you forgive such a painful betrayal? And what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like to support the channel. Also, check out the next recommended video by clicking the card on your screen. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.